Okay, we're going to finish recording now. This is where we ended up last night. I got late and I got tired, and I decided to stop it halfway in between. So I'm going to finish the chapter now. This is where we ended up. We were talking about cocaine. They use cocaine in Coca-Cola, as you can see the changes in the Coca-Cola bottle over the years. They used cocaine until about the turn of the century. Coca-Cola has been around since the 1880s. They used cocaine in it until the turn of the century, and then they decided to switch to another stimulant, and that stimulant, of course, was caffeine. As it says, Coca-Cola still has cocaine in it, actually, but it has cocaine extract. It's not a stimulant. The stimulant, of course, is caffeine. Lots of problems in the United States. We're going to talk about a lot of drugs that were banned in the United States. Usually, there was a reason why they were banned. People kind of ignored them until they decided that this drug represented a select group of individuals, and if they wanted to ban those individuals or slow them down in coming to the United States, they would outlaw the drugs that were they assumed had something to do with that population. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Of course, the United States was not paradise at this time. As a matter of fact, it was pretty alcohol-soaked. Drunk and high men made poor workers, and they made horrible, horrible husbands for women. Of course, they'd come home drunk, and they would abuse their families. At this time, there were no laws against husbands abusing their wives. There were no laws about husbands abusing their children, and to the extent that a man could actually kill his children, and they wouldn't prosecute him for it. Inebriation impeded responsibility, and abuse among drinkers was common. The first temperance organization in the United States was started in the United States in 1826. To understand why temperance was so widely accepted in the United States, we have to understand the women's lot in the early 19th century. Contraception was illegal in the United States. It was considered pornographic. So women tended to be pregnant almost constantly until they died, or until they went through menopause, or until something happened to them so that they couldn't reproduce. There was no way of stopping reproduction. The drinking pattern in the United States followed the path of cheapest booze. In the United States, of course, corn was king. Corn liquor was the least expensive, of course. It was easier to transport your corn by making alcohol out of it rather than trying to haul all those ears or all that grain. It was just too heavy. So what they would do, they'd make corn liquor, and then they would transport it wherever they needed to go. So if they were growing corn, either they were feeding it to their pigs, they were eating it themselves, or if they had a surplus of corn, they would make corn whiskey. And Americans were drinking voluminous amounts of whiskey. And this was corn whiskey. This is the hard stuff. We're not talking about beer. We're not talking about wine. We're talking about whiskey. Women saddled with sporting husbands were likely to raise their children in poverty and have to accept his drunken abuse. U.S. consumption of alcohol in 1830 was 7.1 gallons of pure ethanol for each citizen compared to 1.8 gallons today. We're talking about pure alcohol here, most alcoholic beverages, the hard liquors, are between 120 and 150 proof. Pure alcohol is 180 proof. So this is a lot of alcohol. Now the reality is that we're talking about 7.1 gallons of pure alcohol for each citizen. Children certainly didn't drink alcohol, and women rarely drank alcohol. So you're talking about a lot of alcohol for a lot of men. 7.1 gallons, that would be quite a bit. Today, if we look at each citizen in the United States, they consume 1.8 gallons of pure alcohol. So that's a lot less What is that? 1/5? Nope, not 1/5. That would be 1/4 of what it was once upon a time. First state to prohibit the sale of alcohol was Maine in 1851. By 1855, this is before the Civil War, 1/3 of the states in the United States had laws controlling the sale of the use of alcohol. So prohibition was very common in the United States throughout the 19th century. There were some states that didn't do that, and a lot of states, the reason that they didn't do that is because they had large German and Irish populations, and alcohol was very important to those populations. But if they were not German or were not Irish, then if they were English or Scottish or French, then probably they didn't drink a lot of alcohol. So it was easy for them to pass laws of prohibition. By 1920, enough states, 33 out of 48, limited the use of alcohol to lead to the passage of the Volstead Act, which prohibited the manufacture or sale of alcohol. 33 out of the 48 states. Now we're going to talk about prohibition, and it lasted from 1920 until 1933. It lasted for 13 years, and there were some problems. And the reason there were problems was because, as you can see, 33 of the 48 states already had prohibition, so they didn't really have that much trouble with prohibition. It was those other 15 states that were the problem. So when we talk about prohibition and we talk about all the organized crime, we're really talking about states that were close to Canada, New York, Ohio, Illinois, California. We're talking about states that didn't have prohibition prior to the Volstead Act. The states that already had prohibition, they really didn't have a problem with prohibition. So the organized crime wasn't in Tucumcari, New Mexico. It wasn't a problem in Topeka, Kansas. It wasn't a problem in Muncie, Indiana. It was a problem in Chicago. It's a problem in New York. It's a problem in Los Angeles. And that's where the organized crime was. It was in those 15 states. But the other states didn't have a problem. And we're going to see that it actually worked in a lot of cases. So when we're talking about prohibiting alcohol, we're primarily talking about anti-immigrant movement against the Germans and against the Irish. They were big drinkers. As a matter of fact, if you look at some of the political cartoons from the 19th century, a lot of them will show the Irish and Germans as big drinkers, and other groups were not nearly as big as drinkers. So the prohibition movement was an anti-immigrant movement to some extent, and the immigrants they were trying to stop were Irish and Germans. But of course, alcohol wasn't the first psychoactive substance regulated. In 1909, the Opium Exclusion Act was passed, banning the importation of opium into the United States for use other than for medicine. Now, who in the world were they trying to keep out of the United States in that case? Well, the people they were trying to keep out were the Chinese, because the Chinese had an opium problem. Sure, they had an opium problem. The British forced it on them during the Opium Wars in the 1830s and 1860s. So the Chinese tended to have opium problems. When I was living in Montana, there was an area of Havre, Montana, that shows what was going on in the 1880s. Havre, there was this huge prairie fire that just wiped out the town, and the town didn't exist except in the basements of all the buildings that had been destroyed. So the town suddenly became an underground city, as weird as that is. And that portion of Havre still exists. So you can go to Havre Underground and you can see an ice cream parlor, you can see a butcher shop, you can see how they actually lived when the buildings needed to be restored. And so these people were living underground. And one of the areas, there's an area that they have a brothel, but one of the areas that they show is an opium den. It's a Chinese opium den that was in Havre, Montana. Now, the interesting thing is that today there are no Chinese people living in Havre, Montana, but in the 1880s there were. And these individuals came to the United States to work on the railroads, and there was a fear, especially in the West, that that Asia would send over all of their excess population, and that was a lot of people, and so they were afraid of of Chinese and Japanese, anybody from Asia. They were afraid that they would take over the United States with their mass population. So opium was a common problem among Chinese immigrants, and of course, by making opium a banned substance, they were able to. They hoped that they were driving out the Chinese, or the Asians, actually. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotic Act was passed, labeling opium as a narcotic to be controlled by the federal government. The United States actually had a ban on immigration coming from Asia in 1889. It's one of the reasons, and that ban not only banned the Chinese, but also banned the Japanese, and the Japanese were pretty upset about it. The Japanese consider themselves superior to all other people, and when they were banned by the United States not being able to come into the United States, they were quite upset about it. And this is one of the reasons why the Asian population in the West was fairly stable, because they were banned. Well, the Volstead Act was repealed in 1933. Other psychoactive substances have been added to the list of controlled substances in the United States. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, banning the use of and cultivation of cannabis. This is in 1937. In 1965, okay, so you're going to ask, why in the world would we ban marijuana? And it's for the, if you look at the name marijuana, it is a Spanish word meaning Mary Jane, as weird as that is. But marijuana, of course, it was considered, we thought that, or there were select individuals that thought that marijuana was being smuggled into the United States among the immigrants coming in from Mexico, and they were trying to stop the Mexicans, and we will talk about that in just a second. 1965, Drug Abuse Control Amendments regulated the manufacture of stimulants and depressants. In 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act consolidated all the drug legislation so that they would be controlled out of the same office. Now, this is 1970 and 1965. What was going on in 1965? Well, the Vietnam War had just started, but one of the things that was happening in the United States was the civil rights movement. The black population in the United States was being controlled by forcing the individuals to live in ghettos, especially in some portions of the United States. Because of that, the law enforcement rarely went into those areas. And so drugs were not that uncommon. So by passing the laws in 1965, it was an attempt to control the African American population in some of the places where they were forced to live in select areas, such as Los Angeles. They were forced to live in Watts. New York, they were forced to live in Harlem. In Chicago, they tended to live in the south side of Chicago. So what they were trying to do, they were trying to control the black population. Now, what was going on in 1970? Why in the world would they pass a Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention Control Act in 1970? In 1970 was Richard Nixon was the president of the United States, and one of the problems we were having is the peace demonstrations in the United States against the war in Vietnam. And of course, as far as the government was concerned, it was being fueled by illicit drugs. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. So in 1965, they were trying to control the black population. In 1970, they were trying to control the peace movement in the United States, which was primarily young college kids. mostly white college kids. It kind of clashed with the civil rights movement. The two kind of got mixed up together, and because of that, there was a lot of confusion as to what was going on. But they were trying to criminalize the use of all these drugs that doctors had been prescribing for an extended length of time. They hadn't been arresting anybody for drug abuse. They kind of created their own problem, in essence. But it was one way of controlling the demonstrators. If they saw somebody smoking pot, if they arrested somebody and they found pills on them, they could throw them in jail for an extended length of time, and they wouldn't have to worry about that individual demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. Richard Nixon was very angry about all the demonstrations. He felt that it wasn't his fault. He didn't start the war in Vietnam, but here they were demonstrating against him, and this was his way of controlling the demonstrations. 1984, the legal drinking age was raised to 21. So did the Volstead Act work? I mean, this is a question that we ask, and if we watch the Untouchables, if we listen to law enforcement, they would tell us that it was the beginning of organized crime. Well, of course, it wasn't the beginning of organized crime. Organized crime has always been with us. As a psychologist, I have to answer this question from my own point of view, and from a medical point of view, because that's another area of my expertise. The answer really all depends on who is answering the question. Like I said, if you're law enforcement, then all the organized crime, all the corrupt politicians, all the corrupt police departments, it was a really bad time for law enforcement. But as far as health is concerned in the United States, as far as domestic violence is concerned, as far as violent crime is concerned, it was a good time in the United States. Cirrhosis of the liver and other alcohol-related diseases declined dramatically because people weren't able to drink excessively. They had to hide in order to drink excessively, and the alcohol just wasn't available to them. Domestic violence fell, which is one of the things that people wanted. Violent crime actually fell by 2/3. So if we're talking about violent crime in the United States, despite all the organized crime and all the St. Valentine's Day massacres and whatnot, violent crime actually went down by quite a bit. I mean, it went down 2/3. Public drunkenness, of course, disappeared, because if you were drunk in public, they would arrest you, and you would be not only fined, but you would be imprisoned for a select amount of time. What negative things transpired that were directly related to the Volstead Act? Increase in organized crime, as I said, but it was mostly in the large cities, especially in the states that hadn't passed prohibition prior to the Volstead Act. Corruption of politicians, of course, they were getting kickbacks from the bootleggers. Corruption of law enforcement personnel, they were getting kickbacks from the bootleggers. Drinking eventually returned to pre-prohibition levels, but it took 20 years for people to start drinking as much as they did prior to the Volstead Act. And since the population had markedly increased, the amount of alcohol consumed was actually lower per person. And we didn't actually catch up with pre-prohibition levels until the 1970s. So yeah, I guess if you were somebody who grew up during Prohibition, then yeah, it took you until the 1970s. I mean, that's what, 60 years? No, it's 50 years. It took 50 years for people to start consuming as much alcohol as they did before. And one of the things that happened today is that hard liquor is not consumed as readily in the United States as the liquors, the alcoholic beverages that aren't as inebriating, beer and wine. And actually, during Prohibition, beer and wine were not prohibited. You could make your own beer and you could make your own wine. It was primarily the hard liquors that we're talking about. But then again, people were drinking a lot of really heavy liquor. They were drinking whiskeys, corn whiskey, and vodka and gin, and a lot of really strong drinks. So what's wrong with pot? Hemp has been grown in the Americas with little problem until it first began to be smoked as a mild hallucinogen in Texas in 1910. From whence it spread to the rest of the West. Actually, marijuana wasn't a problem in the East. The only people smoking, people smoked it in the West, especially in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. But it wasn't being utilized any place except in the cities with the jazz movement. And we're going to talk about the jazz movement in just a second. In the 1930s, the Hearst newspapers ran a propaganda campaign to label marijuana as a narcotic. Before that, it was not considered a narcotic. Part of the complaint with marijuana was that it was being brought into the United States, it was being smuggled into the United States by Mexican immigrants. So it was a way to control the illegal entry of that population. Before that, there was free entry. People were moving back and forth over the Mexican border without any problem whatsoever. But then Hearst decided that he wanted to slow down the Mexican immigrant movement into the United States, and this is one of the ways that he did it. In 1936, 38 states had branded marijuana as one of the most dangerous of drugs. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, banning the growth of marijuana in the United States. Marijuana was used as a drug only in rural areas where it grew wild and in the back rooms of cities where it was identified with jazz musicians and beat poets. And the reason I have this picture is because these are the beat poets of New York. I actually talked to this individual. This is Allen Ginsberg. He came to my college in 1968, and we had a conversation. He asked me what I was going to do when I said I was going to go into advertising, and he said, you ought to be a writer instead. Advertising people are thieves, which was kind of interesting. Anyway, in the 1950s and 1960s, the influence of the beat poets' support of using psychoactive substances, including marijuana, as an act of rebellion caught on with the youth of that era. With the beginning of the Vietnam War. This is the 1950s. Of course, the Vietnam War kind of started in 1963. It didn't officially start until 1965. So the people were beatniks, and a television show that had a beatnik on it was Dobie Gillis, The Love Lives of Dobie Gillis. And so they were comic figures, these people that were considered beatniks. They had beards. You can see them in the movies from time to time. They wore berets. They always wore a sweatshirt with cut-off sleeves. They wore work pants. They had ideas that were different from everybody else. Everybody else was in a suit and a tie. Everybody always wore a fedora. They always wore a hat. Everybody wore a hat back in the 1950s. So if you watch a movie from the 1950s, everybody's wearing a hat. They don't go outside without their hat on. You know, they grab their hat, or they'll forget their hat and have to go back and get it. It's really kind of interesting. Of course, now nobody wears a hat unless it's a baseball cap, of course. With the beginning of the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement became intermingled with youthful rebellion, which by this time was connected to marijuana usage. Amphetamines were first synthesized in 1887 in Germany, as we have said before. Over the years, the substance was used as an inhaler under the name of Benzedrine and as an appetite suppressant. During World War II, amphetamines were used to combat fatigue by both sides. Both the Germans, the Japanese, and the Allies used amphetamines. Before the war, my dad drove ammunition trucks from northern Indiana to southern Indiana, and they gave him amphetamines to take so that he wouldn't fall asleep. You know, he'd make a run, and then he'd have to return to the depot to pick up more ammunition. It was an ammunition truck, and he was transporting ammunition from northern Indiana to southern Indiana. He'd make 2 trips a day, which, of course, back then there were no interstates. Everything was a 2-lane highway. And, of course, he'd have to drive at night, and they wanted him to stay awake, so they gave him amphetamines. He never took them, but he was able to stay awake drinking coffee, as weird as that is. Then he joined the Army in 1942. He joined the Army, and when he was over in Germany, or when he was over in Europe, fighting the Germans, they had amphetamines readily available for anybody. So I guess if you were a speed freak, it was a good time to be alive. The 1950s and 1960s, amphetamine. Sorry, I apologize for the nudity in this picture. In the 1950s and 1960s, amphetamines were used in diet pills. By 1970, it was estimated that 6 to 8% of Americans were using diet pills. Amphetamines were part of the fuel of the hippie movements and the Summer of Love in 1967. Congress passed Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in 1970, and this was primarily to slow down or stop the anti-war movement in the United States. That's what they were trying to do. And of course, the picture, this guy's painting daisies on women's breasts, and the bottom picture shows diet pills. Okay, sports were pretty much the purview of the wealthy and the extremely gifted through the first half of the 20th century. It wasn't important enough to try to cheat or to gain an advantage. With the Cold War after World War II, every field where the free world met the communist world became a battlefield of sorts. The world of sports, and especially the Olympics, became a very contentious area of conflict. This is Johnny Weissmuller. He used to be Tarzan in the movies. He was a swimming champion before he was in the movies. And of course, this guy's a weightlifter. He's kind of big. This lady's a weightlifter. Not a very big deltoid muscles. He doesn't have very big, triceps. His triceps are very big. His aren't, and hers aren't, as weird as that is. This is an individual who was a shot putter, female shot putter in East Germany. This is what he looks like today. He is a male now. He's no longer a female. They gave him so many anabolic steroids that he turned into that it changed his gender. Eastern Bloc countries, led by the example of East Germany, began giving their athletes anabolic steroids, creating super athletes. The world was appalled by the results and came out against the practice in 1968. Since then, all amateur athletic organizations have banned the use of steroids, along with the professional athletic organizations around the world. And we talked about the home run race in 1999. It was being fueled by steroids. Both Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire were taking steroids. Of course, all their records were broken by Barry Bonds. And, of course, Barry Bonds may have been taking steroids. We don't know for sure. We know Sammy Sosa, and we know that Mark McGwire were, but we have no proof that Barry Bonds was. But he's awfully big. He's not nearly as big today. Sedatives have been used since the beginning of the 20th century in the form of bromides, chloral hydrate, and paraldehyde. Barbitol was marketed as Veronal in 1903. Phenobarbital was developed in 1913. These are things to put you to sleep, or to calm you down if you get too excited. Sedatives became very popular during the Depression and World War II eras, peaking in this time period with over 50 different barbiturates dominating the market. In the 1950s, doctors realized that they had not only overprescribed the drugs, but they had created a whole generation of addicted adults. And that's kind of what has happened today with painkillers. And I can remember when this happened, and I was thinking at the time, this is dumb. The doctors came out in 2001. They said, "Hey, look, we're not controlling pain well enough. We have a lot of people that are in pain. We need to up our game, and we need to do that by giving them more painkillers. We need to give them more opiates. And this happened in 2001. So the AMA suggested that people do that, the doctors provide more painkillers. So instead of just giving somebody 5 days or 7 days or 10 days of painkillers, they decided that they needed to give them more. And the more that they gave them, of course, the more likely that that individual became addicted to opiates. And that's why we have such a problem with prescription painkillers today. They overprescribed the drugs, and they did it on purpose, thinking that they were helping the people that were in so much pain. And of course, it was a mistake. In the 1950s and 1960s, a whole group of milder tranquilizers were developed to replace the more dangerous tranquilizers. Miltown and the benzodiazepines such as Librium, Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, and Halcyon became the most widely used drugs in the world. Ergot or barley rust had created havoc wherever it appeared, and no one knew why until Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann. We saw him as an old man before. Here he is as a young man. This is what he looked like when he first discovered LSD. He isolated the active ingredient, and it turned out that the active ingredient in the fungus that caused all the problems were lysergic acid diethylamide. It was lysergic acid diethylamide. After his discovery, Hoffman accidentally dosed himself and discovered the psychedelic effects of the substance. It's really kind of weird. LSD, if it gets on a mucous membrane, it will enter the body and it'll go in right to your brain. So if you splash it in your eye, if you splash it on your lip, all of a sudden you're going to be taking a trip, as weird as that is. That's what he discovered. He splashed some in his eye and he took a trip. And of course, he felt that this was a very dangerous substance. Well, since we're Americans and we know how to do these things, the United States Army found out that Hoffman had this fabulous psychedelic substance, and they bought it from him, the United States Army and the CIA, and they decided that they were going to militarize it. They were going to make it into some kind of a weapon. So they brought it to the United States. They brought LSD to the United States, and they started experimenting on it. The CIA especially did experiments, but the Army did too. But the CIA was doing experiments. One of the individuals that they gave it to, they gave to do experiments, was a Harvard chemist by the name of Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary splashed some in his eye, just like Hoffman did, and he took a trip, realized that it was so mind-expanding, dude, that he had to give it to the rest of the world. And of course, after that, it was no longer just a CIA and Army drug, and it's a relatively simple, as you can imagine. I mean, it's a substance found on a fungus. It's a relatively simple substance to create, if you're a chemist anyway. And he gave it to the rest of the world, and that kind of fueled the 1960s, the late 1960s, early through the 1970s. A lot of the people that used LSD, about a quarter of them have what we refer to as flashbacks. So it isn't as harmless as a lot of people think. Not to those people. Drugs today, 1.5 billion people drink alcohol around the world. 76 million of these people have an alcohol abuse disorder. 180 million people worldwide abuse illicit drugs. 160 million people worldwide smoke marijuana each year. Of course, this is in Berlin. They have a big party in Berlin, and here this guy's got looks like a cigar, a marijuana cigar. It has been estimated that 20 to 60% of all hospital beds are inhabited due to drug abuse. Really irritating. You're working in the emergency room, and everybody that comes in, especially on the weekends, they're either drunk or they have been they've been using something, and by golly, you have no choice but to admit them, of course. Uh, it's really frustrating because you're there to help to cure people of their problems, but not a self-induced problem. It's not. It's like everybody coming in has tried to commit suicide or something, and which is fine. I mean, you save people's lives, but it's really irritating. You wanna save people's lives because they had a heart attack, or you want to fix their problems, but drug abuse is one of those self-induced problems. Illicit drugs figure into the economic structures, both where they're grown and where they are used. Heroin, cocaine, marijuana, MDMA, ecstasy, and methamphetamine are some of the drugs that are fueling the economic world. We're going to talk about that right now. Illegal heroin is grown in 4 areas of the world. The Golden Crescent is an area in Southwest Asia that encompasses areas of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. The Golden Triangle encompasses parts of Southeast Asian countries of Thailand, Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, and Laos. Thai sticks, Vietnam. One of the problems that the United States military had was Thai sticks. Thai sticks are opium. It's heroin. It's heroin on a stick. It's kind of mixed with all kinds of odd things. You never know what you're getting, of course. Sometimes it's mixed with marijuana, and usually it's mixed with marijuana. Sometimes it's mixed with other things. You just never know. Anyway, people got really hooked on Thai sticks. Mexico exports a form of heroin that is dark in color and called black tar or brown heroin. Colombia not only exports cocaine to the United States, but a white heroin as well. White heroin found in the Golden Triangle, the Golden Crescent. And Colombia is a purer, stronger heroin. So the whiter heroin is the pure heroin. 90% of the world's supply of illicit heroin comes from the poppy fields of Afghanistan. Now, strangely enough, the United States has partially controlled Afghanistan for ever since 9/11. 60% of Afghanistan's wealth comes from opium sales, and the United States' efforts to curb production has resulted in an increase by 50%. As strange as that is. Maybe we're the ones smuggling it back into the United States. The nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang party dealt with the drug tongs of Shanghai while they controlled China. After the Kuomintang were expelled from China, they continued to grow and market opium along the Thai-Burma border in order to buy weapons for their defense against the communists. So here's nationalist China when they were headquartered on Taiwan, have been smuggling drugs, and of course the CIA became part of that. As ugly as that is, the Vietnam War was a quagmire. Not only was the war being fought in the Golden Triangle, but the United States allied itself with some of the most notorious drug smugglers in the area, a tribe known as the Hmong. There were actually 2 groups, the Hmong and the Ho. They are the mountain people of Thailand and Vietnam and Laos. The Hmong were excellent allies against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong as they moved freely through Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, and they fought the communist soldiers who encroached in the area. Now, unfortunately, we hired these guys to fight the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, but we didn't win that war, and we had to pull out. So what happened to the Hmong and the Ho? We transported as many of them as we could back to the United States. All of this was a secret war that was taking place, but if you go to Detroit or you go to Minneapolis or you go to Duluth, Minnesota, strangely enough, they live in those areas more than any place else. There's a large, very large, relatively large Hmong population in Detroit, and one in Minneapolis as well. Anyway, we had to transport them to the United States, and it was kind of a secret situation because here, we lost the war. We brought some Vietnamese over. We saved some Vietnamese people, but it was the CIA that brought the Hmong and the Ho, and all of a sudden we just have this huge influx of Asians, the Hmong and the Ho. These guys are amazing fighters. They will slit your throat in a nanosecond. And the women of the tribe were just as vicious as the men. They're not sexist at all. Everybody gets to kill. But of course, coming to the United States, they have nothing to fight about. They're relatively peaceful if they aren't being attacked by somebody. Cocaine doesn't grow just anywhere. Cocaine grows mainly in the humid mountain valleys of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. The country that actually produces the most cocaine is Peru, the Amazon side of the Andes. Cocaine has been at the forefront of the political problems in Colombia for over half a century. Drug cartels operate with impunity throughout the country and control many of the decisions being made locally and nationally. Okay, geopolitics of drugs. Worldwide, 25 million people have died from AIDS. That's the total populations of the state of Texas plus the state of Montana. That's worldwide. So if you wiped out everybody in Texas and Montana, that would be how many people have died worldwide, 25 million. Another 40 million have contracted the HIV virus. That's the total populations of California and Oregon put together. In the United States, around 900,000 people are infected with HIV. That's the population of the state of Montana, which has the fourth largest landmass in the United States. While 500,000 people have died of AIDS, that would be the entire population of Seattle suddenly being dead. Of course, how many people have died of COVID-19? I looked just before I started this, 171,000 people have died from COVID-19 as of today. When the AIDS epidemic first hit in 1982, 1983, I was working in medicine at the time. We had no clue. We were naive. We had no idea what was going on. This problem hit the hospitals, and we didn't even know what it was. We didn't know it was a virus or a bacteria. We had no clue what was going on. We just had all these gay guys coming in, and they were coming down with these really strange diseases. It was really weird. 1982, 1983. In 1982, 1983, we didn't wear gloves. Gloves were relatively uncommon. I drew blood and I never wore gloves until 1982 and 1983 because the probability of contaminating myself with anything was fairly remote. There wasn't anything out there that could hurt me. And then the AIDS epidemic hit. We had no clue what it was, and we were scared to death because we were medical people and we were scared to death. We had to take care of people, but we had no idea why or what it was. So we started wearing gloves. In the beginning, of course, since we didn't use gloves, gloves were relatively uncommon. The only people that wore gloves were people doing autopsies and people doing surgeries. So we had to really ramp up the number of gloves. It was kind of like PPE now with the COVID-19 problem. They had to figure out how to make those gloves, and they had to make them fairly skin tight. And there were a lot of people with allergies against the gloves, so they had to make them hypoallergenic. It was just a mess. It was similar to what's going on with PPE today. We still don't have enough PPE for all of our medical personnel, but we're trying to keep ourselves from dying from COVID-19. But in time, it spread into the intravenous drug injecting population and now is more likely to be contracted by sharing contaminated needles than any other cause. Whole masses of gay males were being wiped out in the cities around the United States because they were having sex with individuals that had HIV. How did you know you had HIV? We didn't even know what it was, so we couldn't identify it. In 1985, I was playing in a soccer game, and I had my spleen was ruptured in the soccer game. So they had to do surgery. They gave me 6 units of blood. Well, in 1985, we couldn't detect HIV. We had no way of detecting it. So I got 6 units of blood, and of course they had no clue whether that blood was tainted or not. So for the next 15 years, I had to take blood tests every day to find out if I had HIV, if that blood was contaminated with HIV. I've never been positive for HIV, so I didn't worry about it. I couldn't worry about it. It wouldn't make any difference. They already gave me the blood, but it wasn't tainted with HIV, so I'm good. Either that or it was tainted with HIV, and I fought it off. That's a possibility as well. Hepatitis C is a liver infection that infects 4 million Americans. That's the population of Los Angeles proper. There's actually 17 million people in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, but Los Angeles itself has 4 million people in it. 85 to 90% of all intravenous drug users are infected with HCV, hepatitis C virus, mostly from sharing needles. Now there is a cure for hepatitis C. It just came out a couple of years ago, and so now it is possible to, if you have hepatitis C. In the old days, and the old days were just, before 2 years ago. In the old days, if you had hepatitis C, you died with hepatitis C because there's no way of getting rid of it. Now, of course, we can treat it. Ever since the Roaring '20s, people have been mixing the coolest of music with psychoactive drugs. In the 1920s, it was jazz being mixed with cocaine and bootleg liquor. The women were called flappers, and the men were referred to as either jazzbos or sheiks. And the reason they were called sheiks is because of a movie called The Sheik of Araby, where Rudolph Valentino played the sheik, of course, and all the men wanted to be able to seduce women like the Sheik of Araby. Anyway, the women were called flappers. They wore dresses that were, as you can see, the lady's pulling up her skirt to show off her legs. This is something that wasn't done before the flapper era. The women wore dresses. Before that, they wore their hair. They rarely cut their hair, but in the flapper era, they bobbed their hair just like that lady has her hair bobbed. They wore low-cut dresses before. They never showed any décolletage, any cleavage. And they wore dresses that were relatively short, and they showed off their legs, something that never happened before. And they were referred to as flappers. And the men, of course, you can see the guy's got his hair all oiled back. He's a jazzbo or a chic because he wants to look like Rudolph Valentino. Rudolph Valentino, of course, was Eastern European. He had black hair. Hiya, Jack. He had black hair, and he was cool, and he was able to seduce women by looking at them, and that's what men wanted, of course. 1950s, the music was the blues. The psychoactive drugs were heroin and whiskey. The men and the women were either called beats or beatniks. So if you watch a movie from the 1950s, you might see a beatnik. They are the cool people. They're the ones that their hair is kind of not combed, So it was the era of the pompadour. It was the era of combing your hair. Everybody had their hair slicked back. But then, of course, we came to the 1950s and people stopped combing their hair. The beatniks stopped combing their hair. Everybody else combed their hair, of course. So the beatniks, and they wore work shirts, and they didn't wear ties, and they didn't wear hats. They were cool. 1960s and 1970s, the music became hard rock. The psychoactive drugs that fueled the music were LSD, speed, marijuana, and wine. The people were hippies and the women were chicks. It was a time to liberate yourself. Women before that, they wore a lot of undergarments. Everybody wore a girdle. Everybody wore a brassiere. And then all of a sudden, the hippies and the hippie chicks didn't wear any underwear. And this was their way of rebelling against the establishment. And of course, the men didn't cut their hair. They grew lots of facial hair, and they let their hair grow. And they were the cool ones. And they listened to the coolest music, of course. And they took all the drugs and smoked all the pot they possibly could. As we drifted into the new millennium, the music became techno or electronic trance music. The psychoactive drugs that fueled the craze were MDMA, marijuana, nitrous oxide, ketamine, GHB, and lots of beer. The participants are referred to as ravers. And of course, these are the bottom picture. This is a picture of a rave in Berlin. They used to have it every year. They stopped it for a reason. Some people died. If you take MDMA, and we're going to talk about MDMA, it's not like something that you can take every day. Your body sweats a lot. Your body expels a lot of fluid, and you're hot. And you can actually cook yourself from the inside. It's really kind of unfortunate. Marijuana continues to create controversy. Legalized in many states for medicinal purposes. It's also been legalized in 11 states. In 20 states, it requires a prescription. Marijuana continues to be the most widely used illegal drug throughout much of the world, including the United States, Canada, Australia, New Mexico, Mexico, and South Africa. This is a picture of Amy Winehouse. Amy Winehouse died of a drug overdose. The drug she overdosed on was alcohol. She poisoned herself with alcohol, and she died. Thank you. The destructive effects of tobacco have prompted many countries to try to curb its use. Cuba banned smoking in public places. Ireland has banned smoking in pubs. In many states in the United States, smoking is banned in any public area. This includes Iowa, Illinois, Arizona, and Montana. As late as 1966, almost half the population smoked regularly, 42.6%. If you watch an old movie, you watch an old television show, you're going to see a lot of people smoking. By 2005, the percentage of regular smokers in the United States had declined to less than 1/4 of the adult population, 22.5%. This decline had much to do with the discovery that cigarettes contain many carcinogens that cause disturbing medical problems. 1,178 people die every single day from the effects of smoking. A study in England showed that smoking can reduce life expectancy by 10 years. And here's a picture of former President Ronald Reagan handing out Chesterfield cigarettes as Christmas presents back in the 1950s. Despite the reduction of revenue for tobacco companies in the United States, don't worry, they're not going to go destitute. They've been able to keep profits up by developing foreign markets in the third world. In the United States, tobacco manufacturers have tried to sustain their market by targeting females, minorities, and younger smokers. In 1998, tobacco companies agreed to pay $246 billion over 25 years for their illicit practices in the past. And we'll get into that when we talk about tobacco. They were doing some really ugly things, and they were lying to everybody. Nobody likes to be lied to. Worldwide, 33 million people use amphetamines or similar stimulant substances. In the United States, 16,000 meth labs were raided in 2004. However, meth labs have been partially controlled by controlling the precursor chemicals ephedrine and pseudoephedrine found in common cold remedies. And this is a picture of 2014. Okay. That's a picture of all the meth labs that were busted in 2014. There were 9,338 of them. As you can see, Indiana is the number one, had the number one most meth labs. Before it was Indiana, it was Missouri. Missouri had the most meth labs, and then it moved into this area of the Midwest, Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And of course, Indiana continues to be the number one meth lab. It's the meth lab capital of the United States. Treatment for amphetamine usage has skyrocketed in the past decade. In 1993, only 21,000 people sought treatment for amphetamine addiction. This figure had increased to 151,000 by 2004. Other stimulants also make an impact on our lives. The use of caffeine in recent years has increased markedly. Coffee kiosks have sprung up in tiny towns, and sales of caffeinated soft and energy drinks have exploded. And there are some of them: Rockstar, Monster, Full Throttle. Red Bull, of course, is the oldest. I'm not sure what the Burn one is. 18% of teens, that's 4,300,000, have abused Vicodin in the form of hydrocodone in 2004. Hydrocodone is the most widely used and abused prescription opiate. 10% of teens, that's 2,300,000, abuse the opiate Percodan in the form of OxyContin, the time-released version of oxycodone. And there you go. That's what it looks like. That's what you look like when you're on drugs. You're just the coolest guy that ever was. Alcohol directly kills 75,000 people a year in the United States. COVID-19 has been here. I think we had our first death in the United States in March, and we've lost 171,000. So we're surpassing. Okay, COVID-19 is surpassing alcohol. Alcohol directly kills 1.8 million people worldwide every year. 17.6 million Americans have an alcohol abuse problem. That is 8.5% of the adult population. Alcoholics make up 10 to 15% of people in hospitals, 10 to 20% of people in nursing homes, which is just frustrating and irritating as hell if you're a medical person. When MRIs were done on gamblers, the portions of the brain that were activated by winning and losing were the same areas that were activated by cocaine. Statistics show that 2.5 million Americans are classified as pathological gamblers. 3 million Americans are classified as problem gamblers. 50 million Americans are at risk for problem gambling. One study in Minnesota in 2004 found that 1% of the gamblers accounted for 50% of the wagers. In the same year, among the riverboats of Illinois, 10% of the gamblers accounted for 80% of the revenues. That's a lot of money being wagered by a very small proportion of the population. While gambling may be the most economically devastating behavioral addiction, there are others that are equally personally devastating. Compulsive overeating, anorexia, bulimia, and internet addiction, sexual addiction, excessive TV addiction, compulsive shopping, and pornography addiction. Pornography is the number one site. Pornography sites are looked at more than any other sites on the internet. That includes all the gaming sites, as weird as that may be. And that is the end of this lecture. Sorry that I didn't get it all as one, but